I've been implementing business intelligence solutions since 2010, and in this video, I'm going to share the process that I use with my clients to help them set up their dashboards, reporting, everything automated. So let me show you what we do. I'll walk you through the process that I use, and then I'll also share some of the best practices that I've discovered over time. I'll give you an example for one of my clients that I worked with a long time ago when I worked at IBM. It all started with a spreadsheet. They were trying to analyze a spreadsheet. They were putting many hours every single week generating the spreadsheet to get some reports and metrics from it. And I've seen many businesses are at this stage. They are extracting their data and they populate the spreadsheets and they generate their graphs and charts, put it into their PowerPoint, and then they do this every single week. Or multiple times in a week, however often they need that report. Having a solid strategy and a solution in place makes it so you don't have to do this manual work every single time. The report's always up to date for you. So how do we do that? The first thing I like to take a look at is, what are we trying to solve for? What's the problem that we're trying to get the data for? What are our business objectives? So for one of my clients that was a school district, we wanted to know how the leaders, the school administrators are doing at their job. So we had data coming from lots of different places. One of the sources was the HR system for where their performance reviews were. So we had a very clear business objective in mind. Ultimately, all of this was so our students do better in schools and the teachers are supported the way they're supposed to be. Ultimately, that's our business goal. Now we needed to talk about what questions do I need to answer with this data. And one of the questions was, how are the principals and the assistant principals doing in the school? What's their track record like over time? Do they need help anywhere? So that's how we defined our questions. And then what key metrics should we be tracking? It's really important to define what our metrics are up front. So that way we're going to be pulling the data from different sources, and then we know what kind of data we need to pull. And then you have to identify what are those important data elements that you need, because there could be a lot of data out there from all these different source systems. But one of the things we need to know is which data element is going to answer those questions. And we'll see why later down the line, because we might have to split up those data elements into different things based on the question we want to answer. You can ignore the numbers here. That's just me trying to catalog a detailed video for any of these little boxes. So what's the next step? So the last section was trying to get a clear understanding of what we're trying to achieve. And then in this section, now we're going to start looking at what kind of data do we have on hand. At a high level, it's important to figure out what kind of data we have even available at our organization related to the business department that we're in. The data might come from lots of different sources. For many businesses, they're hooking up their analytics from Google Analytics and HubSpot and a lot of other marketing data. And there could be a lot of lead generation, sales stuff. All of this data is coming from different places. So we want to just write down the different source systems that we have in place. And also what current infrastructure we have. Do we have a database in place already that we're collecting all the data from and putting into, or is it just sitting in some CSV files? What's that full landscape? But also in this technology infrastructure, we want to also look at what kind of reporting we have in place already. Do we have Google Suite, or are we using Microsoft Office 365, SharePoint? Everything relevant to our reporting, everything relevant to our data sources, we want to capture in this area. We also want to talk about who's going to have access to things in the organization. So who has access to what data in the organization, especially when it comes to this report or the dashboards that we will be building. And if you can define this up front, then it's going to help later down the line when we're building the dashboard out. At this stage, if you've already been generating some sort of a report on spreadsheets or some other way manually, then you already know some of those important data elements that are needed for your report. But if you haven't, then this is a good time to start doing some data exploration, and I'll touch on that in a second. Many times what I've seen from my clients is that they'll know that there's data in such and such source system and it's coming from there, but they don't know what it looks like. They don't know the quality of it. So always a really good idea to do a quick data quality check in each of your source systems and tables, because now you know if that data is even usable in your ultimate report, or what kind of massaging you're going to need to do, what kind of transformation you'll have to apply on it to make it usable. Also think about what kind of skill set you have on your team. Working with my enterprise clients, we saw there's a huge range of skill set that everyone has. Enterprise clients always have a technical team that's going to be building out the dashboards and reports for them. But a lot of the smaller businesses don't have that level of team. Even besides just the team that's building the dashboards and reports for you, there's also how comfortable people are who are going to be using and generating these reports with the technology. So good way to get some sort of an idea. That way, later down the line, we know what kind of training we need to do, what kind of features we need to build in place, so it is easier on the users. Okay, so that was us looking at the current data landscape. But before moving forward, which will be designing and architecting the database and where we're going to store the data warehouses, before we do anything like that, I like to do some sort of a prototype. I like to take those spreadsheets we have and build a visual dashboard on Excel or Power BI, any of these tools. I've done this with Cognos and Tableau, different tools that I've used in the past to just prototype my dashboards and my reports. This gives us an idea of what we're going to be building, what kind of visualizations we'll be needing down the line, and that also informs us what kind of data structure we need to have in place. This is also a stage where I like to take a look at what are the most important data elements, what are the most critical reports that we want to be incorporating into this report, what are those things that take the most time to produce. That way we can free up our resources in other places and this report be completely automated in the system. If I don't have a report already and I don't have any existing spreadsheets, then I like to do data exploration. Sometimes it's from extracting from a data source altogether. So I've extracted from a database before, and I've also just looked at CSVs and Excel files that clients have had and try to make sense of the data and just take a look at what kind of data elements we have available, what kind of charts, graphs, what kind of information we can extract out of those data sources. So this is where I like to do my data exploration. Then I validate that with my clients and see what are those important elements, what are the things that are not necessarily needed, what makes sense together. Usually what I'll do is I'll just throw some data in the pivot table and just take a look at what the data looks like. This also gives me that idea of all the different combinations of data, so helps with the data profiling a little bit too, but also I get to get an idea of what data makes sense with which element when I'm doing cross data element references. So for example, sometimes data is categorized in different ways. So like some things have a status, location. These things there's a set amount of those status or locations. So we can make a reference table, we can make a lookup table from that. And we already know our predetermined values that we can populate this table with as a reference table. So this step helps us figuring out some of that later down the line when we're going to be building our database. So what do I mean by we're going to be building a database? What happens is a lot of times we have so many different data sources. Let's say we have 3 or 4 or 5 different data sources coming, like I mentioned, Google Analytics, HubSpot, could be some other sales CRM. We have different data sources. We can pull in that data and use a tool like Power BI or Looker Studio. But what we'll have to do is we'll have to build our data ingestion. That means we'll bring in the data. And then we have to do our transformation at that Power BI level. That is good for data exploration and prototyping. We can get an idea what kind of models we'll be needing to build. But if that file gets deleted or corrupted, or you want to move to a different BI solution, you'll have to redo all that work. Also, the performance of that is going to be very slow because you're doing all those calculations, transformations at that Power BI level. But what you really want to do is do it at a database level so it can increase the performance and you can store the data over a long period of time, and you don't have to get it from these data sources every single time because data sources change all the time too. For example, Google Analytics just went through a version change. And what if you change one of your source systems? Now you don't want to lose all of that data with that source system. So you want to capture that source system and into a database. So you have that data going forward. So you have historical data, you have data going forward, you can do trend analysis, you can do historical data, predictive analytics like this. So it's really important to have a good database in place. When it comes to designing a solution, one of the things I like to do is to develop some sort of a data flow diagram, also a process flow. So it's obviously, you can see it's very similar to what I'm showing on the screen. I guess I like to make these process flows, but what it really helps with is figuring out what are the steps and what's the different stages that data is going through, which source system the data is going through, especially if there's some sort of data extraction, then there's some data manipulation, input, transformation, and then it goes back into another system, and then more stuff happens in that system, and then it comes out again. That I've seen that many times. And in different clients, I've had different experiences. Some people have had no documentation of any of their systems. So I've had to interview the different developers, different technical teams, the business owners, and answer those questions. Where's your data coming from? What happens to it? A lot of times, even the technical teams fully are not sure what is happening besides outside of what they're touching. One of my projects, I was working with financial data, and we were trying to set up operational reporting for SLA agreements to make sure if we're hitting those SLAs or not. We were talking with probably 5 or 6 different teams, and because the data was coming from all sorts of places, it was being processed at different levels. And we had this conversation every single week, and people just were kind of confused where the data was coming from. And every single time it was like, oh, was it here or was it there? So all I did was I took an hour and a half and just put this type of a diagram together, a data flow diagram, to figure out what are the different steps that's happening to the data. That next following week, when we had that call, I just shared my screen and I said, hey, here's what I've put together based on my understanding. Can you help me figure out if your section is right or not? And they were like, yeah, that orange box is good here, but if you make the lines, if you take these dotted lines from here, you put it here, that's where it's what's actually happening. Suddenly, light bulbs went off and everyone started to understand what's happening with the data after just 1 or 2 meetings of cleaning up that part. And then everyone referred to that document from there on out. So it's really helpful to have some sort of a process flow, data flow diagrams. We can have a very high level conceptual architecture where we can look at, these are all our data source systems, and the data is going to come to a central data repository. From there, it's going to get transformed, and then the data is going to move to whether downstream reporting, or it's going to be available for dashboards and some sort of a BI tool. After we have our high level conceptual diagram figured out, now we have a better idea where we're going to house this database. So we need to talk about where we're going to store the data and the ways that the data is going to be flowing into it. This is where the data management side of things come in. So if you already have some sort of a data management solution, sometimes it's just creating some additional schemas and databases and tables underneath that database. Many times the data is just going to come in its raw form, and whatever you get out of your different source systems, whether it's through APIs or CSVs or one-time extractions, we'll just take that data and we'll put it into a database unprocessed. And then from there, we figure out what kind of database we need to build. If it's an in-house application, then and it's a transactional application, then a lot of times you'll have just a database already for it. I highly recommend you do not make reports off of a transactional system. So if you have some sort of a system that has a database in the back end, you're going to have all sorts of tables for it. But what happens is if you're pulling data from the same tables where all the data is stored, and it's also it's a relational database, so you have to do lots of joins to the different tables to get the data. And what ends up happening is you impact that source system. So as users are using it, you're trying to extract data from it. So much processing is happening on that database that it slows the users down. They can't use it anymore. So if it's not a reporting type of a system, and it is a transactional system, then you need to extract the data from that database, those tables, and put it in some sort of a data warehouse. You also need that data warehouse, even if it's coming from different source systems. And even if they're all online systems, you want to have a data warehouse for it. So what we'll do at this stage is we'll put the data in its raw form in a database and we will then transform the data based on the logic and whatever calculations we're trying to do, and put it into the tables that make sense for it. So one of your business objectives might all be related to one particular database table with lots of different lookup and reference tables. That would be an example of a star schema data warehouse. And it's called a star schema because it kind of looks like a star. You have one main table and then all these different spokes that are going to it, and those are going to be all related to your reference tables and your dimension tables is what they call it, fact and dimension tables. Technical stuff, don't worry about it. That's usually a job for the technical team to help you walk through how to set that up. And finally, once we have our database ready, then we can start extracting data through it. We can generate reports with SQL. We can extract the data from there, and we can also just hook up our business intelligence software like Power BI. Then we can develop the dashboards from there. We can have drill down on reports from there. We can go into the details. So we can have summary level data, then we can build a detailed data underneath. At this point, some of our key users are using this data now. So we'll build the dashboard. We put it in the hands of our clients. They can start using what we've built and then give us feedback on what they want to incorporate in those dashboards. And then there's also broad user training on how to use those reports and dashboards. One of the big differences between an enterprise and a medium-sized business is the data volume. One of the operational reporting that I mentioned earlier for the financial institution, I was getting 1.5 million rows per day. So processing that is a lot of work and a lot of effort for these databases, data warehouses, but then also there's additional stuff we have to do on top of it, where we have to create some sort of a summary table where we're populating the main screen you have on your dashboard, where you might have your main charts. We might do some of those calculations at a database level instead of the dashboard level, because it's going to be very difficult for Power BI or any of these BI tools to process 1.5 million rows. And that's just for one day. So if you're trying to look at the week's worth of data, that's not going to ever load on these tools. So that's why we have to build additional tables, and the logic and the process is a little bit different for underneath the hood. But either way, the dashboards and the reports come looking nice, and the clients can start using the data to make better decisions for their business. And that's what this is really about. So there's my high-level process of how I've implemented business intelligence solutions for a lot of my clients. And this has worked for enterprise clients as well as some of those smaller areas where it's like a school district. The process for building something like this is very similar overall. I have all these additional videos that are coming out. Things like how can you use AI to make better decisions in your business? How do you use AI-driven data analytics? The one we just looked at is this, how do I implement a BI solution? And then I'll have just other stuff like common stuff to avoid. I'll put some links for you for reference, and I'll catch you in this next video.